Warning: this video discusses sensitive and potentially distressing subjects including suicide, sexual orientation, LGBTQ+ issues, and surgical procedures. This video was created for educational purposes to review studies and sources regarding these topics. Viewer discretion is advised. I will take this video to do the research I was challenged to do. I'll look for population data to support the existence of hundreds of thousands of testimonies and for evidence that the LGBTQ+ community or a segment of it is actively sterilizing or mutilating children. And I'll show what I find with credible sources. After that, you're welcome to clap back with your own credible sources. As a side note, I need to give thanks to the user who took on the burden of offering links to some cases. I will get to those too. A video was posted about how the pride flag is the antithesis of God and is sin. I scrolled right on past that one, but the transcript is here if you want to pause and read it. The next video was a response to a rather innocuous comment. Seeing one tone-deaf post is annoying. Seeing a second one that makes preposterous claims is a problem. Here's a transcript of the full video, my comment, and his reply. Pause to read. Before we dive in, a quick note to the creator that I'm responding to. If my initial comment sounded hostile, that was not my intent. Upon rereading it, I realized I responded with frustration, and for that, I apologize. You closed comments on the post, so I'm responding here. Also, I saw your recent video, which I don't think you're referring to me, but I want to be very clear. I don't hate you. I'm not trying to cancel you. Until now, I've followed you for years, even though we disagree on quite a lot. I think you sharing your story has a lot of value for young men who may be at risk of going through what you went through. But you do have a responsibility to your audience to provide reputable sources and take ownership of burden of proof of claims that you make. You're free to say what you want, but this is the internet. Be prepared for criticism when you have a hot take. It's important we review the interaction that happened and break down a couple of things. I've already stated that I should have chosen my words more carefully, and I'm going to assume that he felt attacked, and that's why his response was equally as rude as mine, and I'm going to call us both out for our very poor responses. In my response, I used a straw man argument, which is a logical fallacy. I turned the focus to the abuse in the church, which is a separate issue. It's still a discussion worth having, and I'm game to make a video in the future to dig into the actual numbers of how many children are impacted by one versus the other, but also, as I said, separate issue. In his response to me, he said, "People like me are the problem because we haven't done the research, and if we can't find it, it's because we aren't looking hard enough." I'm sure he believes that, but both of those statements are logical fallacies. The first is a burden of proof, and the second is a false dichotomy. Burden of proof means it's your responsibility to provide evidence for your claims. False dichotomy means you offered only two possibilities. Either the data exists and I find it, or it exists and I can't find it, ignoring the possibility that the data may simply not exist at all. If you want to educate others and be credible, I highly recommend citing your sources. Speaking of, all the sources I've used are linked in a document below, as well as all of the search parameters that I used to find those sources. Next, he engaged in gaslighting by calling legitimate questions nonsense to dismiss my inquiry. And we both used appeal to emotion by bringing in separate trauma to shut down or redirect the debate. This is almost a textbook case in how not to have a productive discussion. We failed. We both need to do better. And I believe we would have been able to course correct if the comments hadn't been closed. I did comment on the video that followed with an attempt to engage in civil conversation, but the creator never responded to me, despite responding to other users who replied to my comment. So I don't know. I guess that's part of why I'm making this video. For anyone who is overwhelmed by the length of this video, the last chapter is a 5-minute TLDR summary. While I encourage you to stay and wade through this massive amount of data with me, I understand that it gets very technical, and we all have more important things to do in our personal lives than read 30+ studies, 40+ articles, 5+ surveys, all to get to the point. At the end of the day, the technical portion is for those who will still want to argue the results. Before we dig into the research, I need to tell you why I took the 40+ hours that it took to do this. Most people don't have time to do comprehensive research, let alone the expertise to verify source credibility, which means influence is a big deal in our society. People with tens or hundreds of thousands of followers can spread fear and misinformation to millions of people in a matter of days. The more emotionally charged a claim is, the faster it spreads. When that claim is true, it's very important for us to act. But when it's false, the damage is real. It shapes public opinion, it fuels fear, and it influences laws and policies that affect real people. The truth is, many of us will believe what we're told by creators that we like or that we trust without checking for proof. That's why, unless a creator provides credible sources or is a credentialed expert in the field, you should take what they say with a grain of salt. Now that we have some context, let's hop in. There are two primary claims from this creator that I want to address, and some items that I want to discuss after the initial claims are proved or disproved. The first claim, in his own words, quote, "A segment of that community started advocating for and trying to normalize sterilizing children, mutilating children, I mean allowing children to be subjected to irreversible things," end quote. As a side note, in his own comments, he stressed specifically that he said a segment of the LGBTQ+ community. That'll be important later, and we'll establish definitions to clarify this argument later as well. The second claim, in his own words, quote, "There are hundreds of thousands of testimonies from children who are now adults that can never have children or who contemplate or commit suicide because they can never undo what they've done to their bodies," end quote. The claim I want to address here is the hundreds of thousands of testimonies. Assuming they do exist, it isn't reasonable to gather, read, and verify hundreds of thousands of testimonies. So the easier way to prove or disprove this argument is population data. For there to be hundreds of thousands of legitimate testimonies, there have to be hundreds of thousands of people who regret their care. To help this argument, we'll assume that every single person who regrets their care has provided a testimony. The second piece of this is the mention of suicide, which is a very real problem in the LGBTQ+ community, and specifically the transgender community. So after we address these two primary claims, we'll take a look at the mental health data for both children and adults in these communities. Hilariously, as soon as I finished all this research, the UCLA Williams Institute released a brand new survey and updated all of the numbers. So I'm going to go through and update a bunch of stuff. So the video might be a little choppy here and there when I revoice any of the numbers that have changed. But we have fresh, brand new, published August of 2025 data. Let's go. Hey, everyone. After I had done all the research and filmed this, something really still stuck in my craw, and I think I just figured out what it is. This is simply my opinion, but it struck me odd that the original post about rainbows, the one before the one I commented on, had the comments close after only 117 comments. And then the reply video was made, that was the one I responded to, and comments were closed at 46 comments. And remember, the numbers of comments includes the creator's replies in that number as well. Then 2 more videos were made, the one with the Bible verse and the one about the cancel culture mob coming. I scrolled through all the comments on the first 3 videos, and they seem to be pretty well split between criticism and agreement. There were a few heated takes, but nothing that I wouldn't expect to see on a hot topic, and I thought it was a rather small number of total comments to be getting upset over haters and feeling the need to close comments and make that cancel culture video. Then it hit me. It was done on purpose as a social media strategy. The reason the same issue is being dragged across multiple videos and comments are being closed is to try to rage bait any of the people who want to offer criticism or have a discussion into moving to the next video to comment. That's going to increase views, that's going to boost your traffic, that's going to boost your engagement. I gotta say, it definitely worked to increase average comments and likes, but follower count did take a hit. I'll show it here. I could be wrong, but it seems like the most plausible reason for this string of videos and behaviors. Let me know if you agree or if you think the few heated comments were enough to shut down discourse and make these additional videos. Anyway, back to the main video. For the sake of argument, let's assume that these claims are true. I'm going to try to prove that a segment of the LGBTQ+ community is actively sterilizing or mutilating children. And 2, that hundreds of thousands of people regret gender-affirming care involving medication or surgery. Let's see if data can back these claims up. On to the first claim. A segment of the LGBTQ+ community is sterilizing or mutilating children. We need to unpack that with population data, medical data, and demographics, because this is a serious accusation and it deserves real scrutiny. First, the claim is vague, so we need to add some clarity and establish some definitions to reduce the ambiguity. We'll start with the segment of the LGBTQ+ community in question. Based on the context, it's logical to assume that the segment in question is the transgender population. So we'll operate on that assumption. If that's not the segment being referred to, I invite the creator to let me know, and I'll redo the research with a focus on the correct segment. Now for definitions. We'll assume in this case that sterilizing refers to surgical procedures or medications that by design or by unintended consequence permanently prevent reproduction. Mutilation is a non-medical term, but in this context, we'll define it as a surgical procedure that alters the genitalia or breast tissue. We'll also define children as minors, anyone under the age of 18. However, that's still vague. It's not all of the roughly 73 million children in the United States that we need to look at. Because of the context of this claim, we can assume that it's specifically children seeking these medical procedures based on their gender identity, or an assumption by others of their gender identity. I'm going to make this assumption because otherwise the claim would include all minors who get reconstructive procedures due to birth defects, accidents, or cosmetic purposes that align with their gender at birth. So we'll say the children in question are children who have declared themselves to be, or been labeled by parents or medical providers as transgender, or have been diagnosed or are experiencing gender dysphoria. And I'll refer to these children as transgender minors moving forward. Now that we have some clarity, we can restate the claim as in the United States, transgender adults are sterilizing and mutilating transgender children. With that out of the way, let's look at who the parents of these transgender minors are. One study evaluated 72 social science reviews and found that over 90% of the reviews assessed concluded that there's no association between parent and child sexual orientations, demonstrating a clear consensus on the issue. From another study, we know that approximately 5 million kids are being raised by LGBTQ+ parents. This would be 6.9% of kids being raised by at least one LGBTQ+ parent. I wasn't able to find any research that specifies how many LGBTQ+ kids are being raised by LGBTQ+ parents. The Williams Institute estimates that 9.5% of the population of youth ages 13 to 17 in the United States identify as LGBTQ+. But a Northwestern Medicine comparative analysis found that roughly 1 in 4 adolescents grades 9 through 12 report a sexual identity as non-heterosexual, even though this study has a very tiny sample size and is misleading because it's simply people who responded anything other than heterosexual, including saying, "I don't know what this question is asking," "I describe my identity differently," or "I'm just not sure." Since there is no available research on the exact number of how many LGBTQ+ parents have LGBTQ+ kids, we'll assume that it is equivalent to the population whole. So we'll go on ahead and say 25%. This means 75% of LGBTQ+ minors are raised by heterosexual, cisgender parents. LGBTQ+ adults are 7 to 9% of the U.S. adult population, and only 18% of them are parents. But that still covers the entire LGBTQ+ population for both adults and children. And we know we're talking specifically about the transgender population, so we need to break it down further, and this is where it gets complicated. Detailed population data on minors is extremely limited. While it's easy to survey a 15-year-old on their gender identity, no one is surveying 5-year-olds on this topic. All of the credible data that I found begins surveying at age 13. But I have to ask, for the sake of this argument, is that young enough? I concluded that yes, it is. I was unable to find any clear evidence that these sterilizations and mutilations are happening in a significant number of minors under the age of 13. Harvard School of Public Health found that no gender-affirming surgeries were performed on youth age 12 and under in 2019, and current medical guideline from the Endocrine Society states that hormone treatment is not recommended for prepubertal, gender dysphoric, or gender incongruent persons. If you disagree with moving forward with the 13 to 17 cohort for analyzing this population data, please present some peer-reviewed data from populations within the United States, and I will gladly update the breakdown. Transgender adults make up 14% of the LGBTQ+ population, or 0.8 to 1% of the total U.S. adult population. Transgender minors make up 7.7% of the U.S. population, or 3.3% of the total U.S. population aged 13 to 17. Knowing the percentages is okay, but what does that look like in real numbers? I would like to break this down in a way that limits variables, but the U.S. Census Bureau provides a limited view of the youth population, only allowing it to be broken down into under 5 years old, 5 to 14 years old, and 15 to 17 years old. I think 13 to 14-year-olds need to be included for our case, so we'll use the Williams Institute percentages to better represent the youth population. We have 2.1 million transgender adults in the U.S. and 724,000 transgender minors aged 13 to 17. 19% of transgender adults are, or at some point in their lives, were parents. That's 399,000 parents. To make this super easy, we're going to assume there is no overlap. So each transgender parent is going to count as a separate household. Next, we need to know how many of these kids are at risk for receiving gender-affirming care, which for this argument is going to be medical interventions involving drugs or surgery. I was unable to find any research on how many transgender adults have specifically transgender kids, which means it's math time again. Earlier, we identified 399,000 transgender parents, and according to Statista, in 2023 there were an average of 1.94 children per household in the U.S. We already assumed each transgender parent is a different household, so we will also assume each of these households has the national average of children. Both of these assumptions favor our argument. This means 399,000 transgender parents would have 774,060 children. We know from the population data that we've been reviewing that while between 9 and 25% of these kids will identify as something other than heterosexual, only 3.3% of kids 13 to 17 identify as transgender. Using the minor population breakdown from the Kids Count Data Center in 2024, we know that kids 0 to 11 make up 64% of kids. While ideally we would only use 13 to 17 to keep it easy, we'll include the 12-year-olds and further favor our argument. 12 to 17-year-olds make up the remaining 36%, also using the rounding margin to favor our argument. So 36% of the 774,060 kids are old enough to talk about gender identity. This is 278,662 kids. Of those 278,662 kids, we can presume that 3.3% of them will identify as transgender or non-binary. That is 9,493 kids. These are the kids that are simply at risk of receiving gender-affirming drugs or surgery. Let's put that into perspective. That is 0.013% of all minors in the U.S. or 0.04% of the minors aged 12 to 17 that are at risk for receiving these procedures. Not even 0.1% of kids are being raised by this segment of the LGBTQ plus community that, per this argument, would put the kids at risk of sterilization and mutilation. We also have to keep in mind that to get this number, we've biased the math to favor the argument and are still left with less than 0.1% of kids only at risk. Now we need to know how many of these kids that are at risk actually receive medical interventions in the form of drugs or surgery. According to a study on the prevalence of gender-affirming surgical procedures among minors and adults in the U.S., surgery rates for minors are extremely low, about 2.1 per 100,000 minors age 15 to 17, 0.1 per 100,000 minors age 13 to 14, and 0 below 13 years of age. A 2025 study from JAMA Pediatrics found that hormone therapy in minors is under 0.1%. Reuters investigates, using data from Komodo Health, found that in patients aged 6 to 17, 29,463 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria on average per year for the 3 years of 2019 to 2021. In this group, there were 3,477 hormone treatments and 1,129 puberty blockers on average per year for the 3 years of 2019 to 2021. In patients 13 to 17, there were 259 top surgeries and 19 genital surgeries, on average per year for the 3 years of 2019 to 2021. This study cites a lack of access for minors in most cases and confirms the lack of these procedures being performed on those 12 and under. We're going to use the numbers that most favor the argument again. So of approximately 724,000 transgender youth, only around 4,884, or 0.7%, receive medical interventions, with only 278, or 0.04%, of those undergoing surgery. The numbers above are all covering the entire population of the transgender youth, not only those with LGBTQ plus parents, or specifically transgender parents. So in order to find out how many of those under 10,000 kids that we identified who have transgender parents go on to get these interventions, we have to do some more math. This can get complicated really, really fast. So I'm going to take the laziest possible approach, which is also the approach that's going to most favor this argument. We already know that 0.7% of transgender minors in the U.S. get some type of medical intervention that is drugs or surgery. So we're going to use that number to determine how much of the population of trans youth with trans parents will receive these interventions. So out of the 9,493 kids that we identified as transgender non-binary minors with transgender parents, 67 kids will likely receive medical intervention, and only 4 of those will be surgery. I want to do one more thing to favor this argument. Because of the new numbers just released a few days ago by the Williams Institute, we're comparing newer studies with older studies. The new population data shows that the transgender youth population has roughly doubled since their 2020 study. And since we're using the 2019 to 2021 averages for medical interventions, I'm going to favor our argument by saying we'll assume the treatment being sought also doubled. This tells us that today in the United States, with the assumptions that we made, approximately 134 children of transgender parents are receiving medical interventions in the form of drugs or surgery. While I believe we could leave this argument here and call it disproved, we still have to consider regret rates. Not all of these kids will regret the care they received. Regret among youth is slightly higher than that of adults, but still very low. One study found about 4.1% regret their care, but only 1.8% are dissatisfied enough to discontinue their care. Using the data from this study, 4.1% of the 134 kids, or 6 kids rounding up from 5.5, transgender minors in the U.S. with transgender parents will regret their care. But we need some perspective. We started with 278,662 kids aged 13 to 17 of transgender parents. This is 6 out of that number, or 0.002%. And while the original claim stressed a segment of the LGBTQ+ population, this number is so absurdly small, let's go ahead and do the math for all 5 million kids who are being raised in a home with an LGBTQ+ parent. Using the same methodology as before, we get 165,000 kids of the 5 million who identify as transgender, and we get 1,155 of those kids receiving medical intervention in the form of drugs or surgery. Same as we did before, we're going to go on ahead and double it. That's 2,310 kids getting medical intervention. That is 0.003% of the minor population in the U.S. We still aren't anywhere near 0.1%. But I'm willing to take the bias for this argument one step further and make an absolutely absurd assumption. We're going to assume that no cisgender parents ever allow their children to receive drugs or surgery. So now we'll say that all 4,884 kids receiving medical interventions annually, then we're going to double it as we have been doing in good faith, so all 9,768 of these kids are in homes with LGBTQ+ parents. Now we get 0.01% of the youth population in the U.S. Even with adding exceptional bias, we still land nowhere near even 0.1%. So the idea that it is the LGBTQ+ community, or a segment of it, that's pushing medical interventions like hormone therapy or surgeries onto children is simply false, based on these numbers. In reality, the parents who make decisions about gender-affirming care are mostly straight and cisgender. Let's remember that the majority of LGBTQ+ minors are raised by heterosexual, cisgender parents, and the medical providers that are the ones who are evaluating and approving these treatments are following strict protocols. The decision to pursue care involves parents and medical providers, not just the LGBTQ+ community. This is important because it challenges the narrative that there's some sort of conspiracy or a coordinated effort within the LGBTQ+ community to mutilate and sterilize kids. Instead, what we see is a complex, careful medical process involving families of all backgrounds. So this claim is factually incorrect. It's not supported by the demographic and social data. The LGBTQ+ community is not orchestrating the sterilization of children. Rather, the responsibility lies with individual families and medical professionals navigating complex, individual care decisions. I said I would mention the articles linked by another commenter. They provided 5 articles, 2 of which I believe were aimed at supporting this claim. The problem is, they don't. While they involved horrible and absolutely unforgivable sexual abuse of children by gay men, they don't involve the issue at hand, which is specifically regarding medical interventions resulting in alleged mutilation or sterilization. So they are a separate topic entirely, but I do appreciate that they were provided. The other 3 we'll get to later. This brings us to the second claim. Hundreds of thousands of people regret gender-affirming care involving medication or surgery. For this claim, we need to prove that there are hundreds of thousands of people who've received this care, so that they would allegedly be giving these hundreds of thousands of testimonies. So we need to return to the population data. Adults identifying as transgender in the U.S. is about 0.8%, or 2.1 million adults. Transgender minors in the US make up 3.3%, or about 724,000 minors. Now we need to know how many people are receiving gender-affirming drugs or surgery with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and how many of them regret it. According to Endocrine Practice, 55% of transgender adults are taking gender-affirming hormone therapy, and 25% of transgender non-binary respondents report having undergone some form of gender-confirming surgery, which includes breast and genital surgeries, as well as things like facial, tracheal cartilage, body contour, body hair, and voice-related surgeries. For adults, a systematic review of transgender patients who underwent gender-affirming surgery in 2019 showed a regret rate of only 1%. But we also need to know how many people regret drug treatments, which doesn't seem well studied in the adult population. So we'll have to do some math to get an estimate. This study states that 13.1% of respondents pursued detransition at some point, and 16.8% of those did it for reasons that could be categorized as regret. Not a very fun fact, the rest of the people detransitioned out of fear, lack of access to care, being pressured by others, or having been threatened or assaulted. For the sake of argument, we'll take the 2.1 million transgender adults, assume 13.1% of them will detransition at some point, which is 275,100 people, and 16.8% of those people will express regret. So 46,217 people, or 2.2% of the total population of transgender people. Since this study includes both surgery and drug therapies, this is going to replace our 1% regret rate. For minors, we've already reviewed their surgery and drug treatment studies, so we'll do the same we did earlier and use the numbers that most favor the argument. So to review, there are approximately 724,000 transgender youth. Around 1.4% of them receive medical intervention. So now, how many regret it? As we mentioned before, regret among youth is slightly higher than regret among adults, but still low at about 4.1%, with only 1.8% dissatisfied enough to discontinue their care. That equates to 415 regretting the treatment they received, with only 182 stopping care. But regret is regret, so we'll say that all 415 grow up and continue to regret their treatment, both surgical and non-surgical. But we need to assume some kids do not regret it as minors and grow up to regret it later, which would bring us back to the adult regret rate that we just calculated, which is 2.2% of the total transgender population, or 46,217 people. The next thing I did was actually a population growth adjustment because the data that we had been using was from 2021. Since we have this hot off the press 2024 data now, it's not quite as important that we do that population adjustment. But for the sake of argument, bringing population growth into it is important because someone will argue that the number of testimonials adds up over the years. So we will go on ahead and do the adjustment for 2024 to 2025. The year-over-year growth rate of the transgender population in the U.S. is not something that seems to be well reported. So fuzzy math aside, we'll use 0.8%, which is the average growth rate of the entire population of the United States over the past 24 years. Again, just for the sake of argument. That gives us our new total of 46,587 adults in the United States in 2025 who regret their medical treatment for gender dysphoria. These are the adults who would be providing these alleged hundreds of thousands of testimonials. The math ain't mathin'. This disproves the claim that hundreds of thousands of children grow up to regret their care and provide testimonials about said regret. Before we dig into the mental health aspect and address the other 3 articles that were linked, I would be doing us all a disservice if I didn't bring up some analogous factors for us to review. When any of us is looking at a topic that we take issue with, we need to stop and do a few things. First, we need to verify that it's true. Second, we need to self-reflect on why we take issue. Is it our religion, our beliefs, our politics, our personal experience, so on? And third, we need to consider the scope. Is this an issue worth pursuing, or are there bigger, more important fish to fry? For this entire video, we've been deeply focused on 1% of the population. That should make you wonder, what's going on with the remaining 99%? Let's take a broader look at cosmetic surgery in adults and minors in the US and the regret tied to those. Breast augmentation regret rates are 5 to 9%, with around 300,000 performed annually in the US. Body contouring regret rates are 11 to 33%, with 600,000 per year performed in the US. Bariatric surgery has a 19.5% regret rate with 280,000 performed in the US annually. Rhinoplasty has a 15.4% regret rate with 220,000 being done annually in the United States. Female sterilization regret rates are 12.7% with 700,000 being performed annually in the US, half of which are performed within 48 hours postpartum. Vasectomy regret rate is 6%, with 500,000 performed annually in the US, and a study investigating regret among breast cancer patients who had undergone breast reconstruction following a medically necessary mastectomy found that 27.6% experienced minor regret and 19.5% moderate to strong regret. That is 47.1% with some level of regret. Other life decisions, such as having children and getting a tattoo, have regret rates of 7% and 16.2% respectively. But this whole debate started over approximately 4,884 minors who received drugs or surgery for gender dysphoria. So in the name of protecting children, let's look specifically at the surgical procedure rates for minors. Since we're looking specifically at surgery, let's remember that of those 4,884 kids who got gender-affirming care, only 278 had surgery. Trying to do in-depth research on this was interesting. Almost every source I could find lumps 18 and 19-year-olds in with the adolescent group. So if you like conspiracies, you should ask yourself if that's to cover up how many cosmetic surgeries are performed on minors. Despite a note saying most of these procedures are only on 18 and 19-year-olds, before 2023, the Society of Plastic Surgeons had a notation in their annual dataset to indicate which procedures included no persons under age of 18. Since then, that is gone. We can only assume that every single one of these cosmetic procedures are now being done on persons under the age of 18. In 2023, a report for 2024 has not been published yet. The Aesthetic Society, in collaboration with Cosmetic, found that 15,248 purely cosmetic procedures were performed on individuals 17 and under. And while we review this data, keep in mind that this survey looked at data from 762 surgeons, while the American Board of Plastic Surgery shows 7,752 plastic surgeons in the U.S. The data from the 762 surgeons shows that of the 15,248 procedures, 426 of them were breast augmentations, 373 of them were breast lifts, 1,500 breast reductions for girls, 856 breast reductions for boys, 406 labiaplasties, over 1,000 liposuctions, over 200 chin augmentations, 1,500 rhinoplasties, and almost 9,000 ear surgeries. No matter how we try to bias the math here, at the end of the day, those 15,248 purely cosmetic surgeries on minors is 0.2% of the minors in the U.S. Looking at those 278 gender-affirming surgeries on minors, that is 0.0004% of the minors in the U.S. Let's double that number like we have before. That makes it 0.0007. Of course, that's because that previous number was rounded up. Next, we're going to go on ahead and look at it and say, even if we make it a function of only the 724,000 transgender youth in the U.S., that 278 gender-affirming surgeries on those minors is 0.04%. But then we're going to do the same thing we've done before and double it. That makes it 0.08% of kids. And let's take it finally one step further and break those surgeries down to only breast and genital surgeries done on cisgender minors. That is 0.004% of kids. When you're looking at the gender-affirming surgeries, I've got both numbers here for our 278 and our double to 556. That is 0.0004 and 0.0007% respectively. So no matter what we do, more cisgender, straight kids are getting cosmetic surgery than transgender minors are getting gender-affirming surgery. The math ain't mathin'. I could sit here all day and give you regret rates. We could sit here all day and do population breakdowns for any of these. But we all know the populations that are receiving the above surgeries vastly outnumber the transgender population. More cisgender children are receiving these cosmetic surgeries under the age of 18 than any transgender child. So now that we know that cisgender youth undergo thousands more breast-related surgeries per year than transgender youth undergo, are we banning those surgeries for cisgender youth? Now, while we've been focused on trying to prove high rates of harm, the data shows the vast majority of gender-affirming care is successful and provides better quality of life. There are some cases where things can go wrong, and there are responsible parties, as we mentioned earlier. The real issue comes down to medical errors and a lack of mental health support. I want to address the later portion of the claim. Quote, there are hundreds of thousands of testimonies from children who are now adults that can never have children or who contemplate or commit suicide because they can never undo what they've done to their bodies. End quote. First, I want to say there's a statement of ownership here. What they've done to their bodies. This statement in and of itself disproves part of the argument being made, as the argument leans on minors being coerced or forced into these treatments and subsequently regretting them. The statement is unwittingly an admission and an acknowledgement that 95.9% of minors and 99% of adults receiving treatment don't regret their choice. Second, I want to dig into the fact that the mean age of surgery remains around 17 years old. Surgery on young children is exceedingly rare. There are lawsuits from youth who regret their care as minors, and the problem here is often cited to be lack of adequate mental health support before they receive medical intervention. So we've got Luca Hine, a young woman who detransitioned, said, I was going through the darkest and most chaotic time in my life, and instead of being given the help I needed, the doctors affirmed the chaos into reality. So here we're left with the medical community needing to improve mental health assessments and provide comprehensive care, just as it does in all specialties. An important perspective comes from expert testimony before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee that really highlights how underlying mental health struggles, trauma, and abuse can contribute to gender dysphoria diagnosis. Some children's distress comes from complex causes that need careful mental health care, not quick medical intervention. The key takeaway here is that all of these young people deserve compassionate, comprehensive mental health services, not fear-mongering or politicized bans on their health care. And something else we need to get to, the 3 remaining articles. One was Kayla Clementine, a UCLA student who's suing California doctors, saying she was fast-tracked to transgender surgery. We've got a woman who transitioned to male at 16 during chaotic times. We mentioned her already. That's Luca Hine. And I believe there was one more. Yes, it was the loophole allowing child sex offenders to adopt by surrogacy. The article about the surrogacy loophole. It's unrelated to the current discussion, but at the same time, when it comes down to these loopholes of sex offenders being able to parent children, that's a whole separate issue, and there is a lot to it. And we'll save that one for another day. I am 100% against any sexual offender ever having a child or being around children unsupervised. But that's a separate issue for us to get into on another day. People who received treatment in a way that was incorrect, whether it be their parents, whether it be their medical professionals, absolutely they deserve recourse. But as we proved with the numbers, this is such a teeny tiny population. 3 cases proves nothing. 100 cases proves nothing. You can look at any medical procedure, and there are going to be these cases where someone felt fast-tracked to a surgery that maybe they didn't end up needing, or who had the wrong limb or the wrong organ removed. There is always going to be some amount of malpractice in every single medical field. So a couple of cases prove nothing. I feel for these people. I hope they get the care that they need. But it doesn't justify trying to take care away from an entire population. I know someone will inevitably send me sources that aren't credible, so I've gone ahead and found quite a few of them myself. But let's define a credible source first. In general, it's a source that provides accurate, trustworthy information written by a respected expert in the field that is primarily free from bias and has been reviewed by other experts in the field. I'll link a handy worksheet for source credibility down below. That's why the majority of the sources that I've used in this research are peer-reviewed studies from the NIH, which is a government entity, sources I was able to verify as centrist, data collected by nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations that have a specialty in the topic. I encourage you to read this article from the news site World. Sound journalism grounded in facts and biblical truth, which contains 4 testimonies of regret from people who transitioned, one in Canada, one in Lebanon, and 2 that don't specify, which I'm assuming are in the US. That's the WGN.org article. The next place I went to is sexchangeregret.com. It's full of resources, and it was created by one of the writers of a testimony that was in that WNG.org article, who created this website as a resource for others who had the same experience. But it grossly inflates the number with no real sources and contains articles and other information, all of which can be reviewed and proved to be false, misleading, or harmful for anybody who's going to take those at face value. I think it's really valuable to take a look at one of these studies that they're citing on this website, which is Detransition-Related Needs and Support, a Cross-Sectional Online Survey, and talk about the problems with this particular research, which is actually, as it says in the name, an online survey. So what they did is they gathered a sample of 237 male and female detransitioners. However, the problem with the way this study was conducted in the methodology is that it's simply based on an online survey via public posts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This is fundamentally problematic because it's not actually based on any of these people's actual medical history, like all of the research that we've reviewed so far. Everyone who answered yes to the question, did you transition medically and or socially, and then stopped, was selected for the study. This is also an inherently flawed question. If you socially transitioned by having people call you a different name, that is by no means the same as receiving medical care in the form of medication or surgery. This is a serious problem with the design of this entire survey. The other issue with this survey is only half the sample was from the United States, a third from Europe, some from Canada, Australia, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Russia, and South Africa. The next thing we know that at least they provide is that 31% of these people only transitioned socially. The data in this really kind of disproves the entire problem here as well once you actually start digging in. Half of the respondents started socially transitioning before the age of 18, but only a quarter of them started medically transitioning before that age. The average age of social transition was just shy of 18 years old, and that for medical transition was almost 21 years old. We're seeing here that these numbers, even in the information that they are providing, are primarily people who are 18 and above. This does not help their case at all if people actually read the study's data. And if you actually dig into the purpose of why this study was even designed in the first place, it's to understand the needs of people who want to detransition. That is very important. And we need to start to build from this survey into actual studies based on the medical data. And that's where we are in the US right now with this entire argument, is that we now have enough information to do more studies and find out how we can best help anyone who decides they want to detransition. But it doesn't change the truth of what this shows us about the age of the people who are detransitioning, at what age they began transitioning, how many of them are only socially transitioning, and what kind of mental health needs as well as physical health needs these people have. In some instances across the site, it contradicts itself. So while this person's story deserves to be heard and their regret should be taken seriously, this can't be extrapolated to a population of hundreds of thousands, as we've already proven. Next, I visited livingstonesministries.org, which is Help for Families. It's a religiously biased source, but again, it's founded by someone who was abused by a parent who happened to be transgender, and it's being used to vilify being transgender. I encourage you to read her story. If you have a history of abuse or trauma from childhood, you'll likely see a lot of yourself in her story. I certainly see a lot of my childhood trauma reflected back. The only difference is my abusers were cis and straight. The person found religion, and the rest is history. They made the story about transness being evil, therefore she was abused, instead of about child abuse being evil, full stop. This is also demonstrated in the small notation about her dad as a man and how he experienced sexual obsessions, much like many men who abuse women and children report. In the segment on her father as a woman, we roll right into the major topic we landed on: mental health care. I'm not going to take the time to read the personal stories on the website, as there are only like 34 articles and 4 videos. But if you take the time on them, please let me know how many of them are relevant and how many of them are unrelated. Same goes for the published articles. There are a lot of them, but most of them don't seem relevant. I do want to address the things they have linked in their scientific studies that they provide. The first one provided is actually a link to a news article, which is from an institute that's known to be biased. The Witherspoon Institute bias fact check is linked in my sources below. This institute is independent. They don't claim to be a media site, so they don't get a rating from all sides, but they do have a media bias fact check. It's easy enough to see that once you've read the study, you know this article completely misrepresents the update that was made to the study after a peer review found an inconsistency. The corrected study is here from psychiatryonline.org. It's a study that was conducted on the Swedish population, and here are the results. Compared with the general population, individuals with a gender incongruence diagnosis were about 6 times as likely to have had a mood and anxiety disorder healthcare visit, more than 3 times as likely to have received prescriptions for antidepressants and anxiolytics, and more than 6 times as likely to have been hospitalized after a suicide attempt. Years since initiating hormone treatment was not significantly related to likelihood of mental health treatment. However, increased time since last gender-affirming surgery was associated with reduced mental health treatment. The conclusion of this study is, in the first total population study of transgender individuals with a gender incongruence diagnosis, the longitudinal association between gender-affirming surgery and reduced likelihood of mental health treatment lends support to the decision to provide gender-affirming surgeries to transgender individuals who seek them. All this study does is prove that we need better, more comprehensive mental health services, and despite what the article they linked says, the study supports giving gender-affirming surgeries. This institute clearly made up some baloney and can't be trusted. It's egregious because they know nobody's going to actually go to the study and read it, so they just say whatever they want. Therefore, I'm going to skip any other scientific studies that link to this same nonsense, of which there were several. The next actual study that they link is a study on PubMed, this one right here. There's literally no point in them having this study here. All it does is proves that transgender is not a genetic disorder of the main genes that are involved in sexual differentiation. It's also a study from 2013, so it's pretty outdated research. The next unreliable source is the Heritage Foundation. They're calling conservative news sites scientific studies. Also, it's an article about the same exact study from before, the one that had the correction. And again, it's being misused in the same way public discourse misused it, and it even links to the public discourse article. Next is another news article on the same thing again. We finally hit a respectable source. Here we go. The New Atlantis. This is very likely worth the read, and while sources do lean it toward a conservative bias, it's still of high factuality. The source doesn't do much for the site's anti-trans rhetoric, but it's a good social piece on gender identity, child abuse, and mental health. I guess they included it just to make their list longer. The next link is just an opinion piece from the WSJ, so more nothing. Then we've got a study that has a correction so long it will spin your head. They even had to change the title, which in my opinion is still misleading, but the conclusion is this. This descriptive, explanatory study of parent reports provides valuable, detailed information that allows for the generation of hypotheses about factors that may contribute to the onset and/or expression of gender dysphoria among AYAs. Emerging hypotheses include the possibility of a potential new subcategory of gender dysphoria, referred to as rapid onset gender dysphoria, that has not yet been clinically validated, and the possibility of social influences and maladaptive coping mechanisms. Parent-child conflict may also explain some of the findings. More research that includes data and collection from AYAs, parents, clinicians, and third-party informants is needed to further explore the roles of social influence, maladaptive coping mechanisms, parental approaches, and family dynamics in the development and duration of gender dysphoria in adolescents and young adults. If you don't want to read that, I'll summarize. There might be different types of gender dysphoria that haven't been studied and variable factors such as family and social dynamics that need to be studied. This is a nothing burger. It proves nothing. There are 8 more links, but I've wasted enough time on this website so far, and everything has either been misleading, trash, or a legitimate source that doesn't prove their point. Next, I got some sources from harvestusa.org, which literally states on the homepage, quote, "Bringing the power of gospel of Jesus Christ to transform the lives of those affected by sexual sin." So we already know the inherent bias here. Most of them led directly back to other sites we already viewed above. So, if you'd like to send me some sources that are actually legitimate, feel free. So then I visited Fox News. They had an article titled, "Puberty Blockers Could Cause Long-Term Fertility and Health Issues for Boys. Study Finds May Be Permanent." And I took a look at that. It's from April of 2024. It cited a study that has not yet been peer-reviewed and is in preprint, aka it's not available to the public. So I'm not going to believe that until the study's been reviewed and printed and you can read the source. Until it's released, it's not credible. As of now, they haven't updated it with new study info, and that study has not yet been released. So my guess would be, since it's been over a year, that study got completely shredded in the peer review process and got dumped. Holy moly, you guys. Quick update on this. I finally found a copy of the preprint version of this study. Let's take a look. All right, there's definitely some interesting stuff going on here. So let's actually talk about the protocol that enrolled the patients. So the patients are between 0 and 17 years of age and have been diagnosed with a fertility-threatening condition and or are scheduled to undergo gonadotoxic treatment. So far, they have collected living specimens for clinical and research applications from initially 92 individuals. 5 withdrew from the study, so they have 87 patients to analyze. 55 of these were oncology patients, meaning they were diagnosed with cancer. 11 of these kids had hereditary diseases, and 16 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So already only 18% of the 87 people that they analyzed would be seeking this for purposes of gender-affirming care. The rest of these young people are doing it because of existing health conditions. They don't mention here any comorbidities for those people, but they do mention here that sperm collection was suggested, but all of the gender dysphoric patients opted for fertility preservation surgery due to reluctance or inability to ejaculate. So they were collecting the sperm with the idea that it was to be used for fertility preservation for these individuals. 2 of the 9 puberty blocker treated patients exhibited abnormalities, who have physical abnormalities here. And the remaining patients displayed everything being normal, where it belongs, etc. It's really interesting here that in their own abstract, from the data that they were able to collect, that they actually state the noted gland atrophy and abnormalities from the histology data raise a potential concern regarding the complete reversibility and reproductive fitness of SSC. The biorepository, data, and research approach presented in this study provide unique opportunity to explore the impact of puberty blockers on testicular reproductive health. Something that's important to understand about puberty blockers when looking at this data is that the drug that's most commonly used was initially developed to treat cancer, which is why a lot of the young people that they're looking at in these studies were oncology patients. It also has applications in treating paraphilic disorders, as well as, of course, delaying sexual maturation in children with precocious puberty. It can be used for hypogonadism and also, of course, as we know, gender dysphoria. So what this study aims to do is analyze testicular biorepository data from pediatric patients with and without chronic puberty blocker exposure. If this study does end up getting peer reviewed. I do see some issues, and I'm sure they're going to have to make some corrections. But while reading this, what I'm really seeing is that it does offer us an insight into the safety of extended use of these drugs. What they did was they found an individual patient that had over 52 months of treatment, and they did a full sequencing of the tissue that they took. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot to be learned from doing things like that, but I would say that that's going to give us a better view of the amount of time a person spends on that versus necessarily what it's being used for. So for anyone who's using these drugs to treat cancer and things like that, some of this is not going to be nearly as important, and we can't extrapolate the thoughts and feelings of those patients with anyone who is using it for gender dysphoria. Those are two completely different cases. And while we can, of course, study the cells and the sperm from all of those groups of people, we can't really toss it all into one big study salad and call it useful. This study also really appears to ask more questions based on what they're investigating than they really do provide any answers. Discussions on things like incomplete differentiation that results in the development of spermatid-like cells without subsequent sperm maturation. And they state here that it warrants further investigation. They can't really come to a conclusion because the research just isn't there yet. I'd venture to guess they're also going to come under scrutiny for the methodology behind some of their logistic regression models and things like that, but that is far outside of my scope. That's just something that I'd venture to guess is going to happen if this study ever sees the light of day. I do have to say, though, generally speaking, I am seeing honest research here, and that they are identifying the questions that they're coming up with along the way, as well as with their regression models in terms of their accuracy, etc., stating these values suggest that the model is generally accurate, suggesting the cell type composition can predict an individual's spermogenic maturity. It should be noted, however, that the low number of data points represents a major limitation for generalizability. So they are being honest here. It is a very, very, very tiny population that they were studying, those 87 people, and that's not statistically significant population data there. So I do have to give them points for the honesty. Their model also suggests that the age at which a drug is administered can affect a patient's testicular niche. So if that's true, that's definitely something that will require a whole lot more research. And I mean, it's really cool to look into these kinds of things and say, hey, what can we learn from this? What should we research next? And what can we find out? But would I say that this study actually definitively proves what Fox News and similar websites are trying to say it does? The answer is no. Some data I would love to see out of this study would be if there were any specific genetic differences between those children who were on the drugs due to treating cancer or any other known issue versus those who were given the drugs for gender dysphoria. That is not something that they break down in this study, and I think that's a major missing point here. Let's see. Here's a fun study titled To Treat or Not to Treat, Puberty Suppression in Childhood Onset Gender Dysphoria. In an attempt to balance the benefits and risks of puberty suppression, and in light of all the available information and knowledge, our opinion is that the enlightened decision would be to allow puberty suppression when the adverse outcomes of a lack or delayed intervention outweigh the adverse outcomes of early intervention in long-term risk for the child. In other words, if allowing puberty to progress seems likely to harm the child in terms of psychosocial and mental well-being, puberty should be suspended. So we've got a whole lot of studies and a whole lot of things that are telling us to basically apply the rules of medical ethics to weigh beneficence and non-maleficence. and really make sure that we're taking care of these kids and their mental health and mental well-being. Which brings us into the next piece of all this, which is the broader mental health care discussion. I've already spent 40 plus hours doing all this research, pulling together all this stuff. I was going to keep going, but the truth is, the more time goes by between the original post and the time I actually get this video out, I think the worse off it is. So instead of bombarding you with any more research, what I'm going to say is this. We're taking mental health care away from tons and tons and tons and tons. You want to talk hundreds of thousands of people? We're taking medical benefits away from hundreds of thousands of people right now. And all of these studies prove that we need better mental health care access, better mental health care facilities, better mental health care screening. It all comes down to the availability of appropriate health care, mental health and physical health, both. We have a government right now that is literally banning words among government agencies, including in science. Let's pull up that list here. Here we go. On the NIH, we have Trump's banned words and disastrous health policies. That's going to lead us to the CDC order for mass retraction and revision of submitted research across all science and medical journal and banned terms that must be scrubbed. So going back to the original memo, the first list of things to be scrubbed were gender, transgender, pregnant person, pregnant people, LGBT, transsexual, non-binary with the hyphen, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, biologically male, and biologically female. How do we study these issues if we can't say these words? And the list has gone insane since then. I'll find the whole list and put it here. But we've got words like woman and sex and things like that can no longer go on here. How are scientists supposed to be able to do their work if they cannot use these words? Every single word on this list is hurting a minority, from women all the way down to the disabled. This is banning our ability to study these things, to talk about these things, to improve life for people who are parts of these populations. So if you support the current administration, then you support taking healthcare away from all of these people. You support the increased rates of suicide. And I know I said I wasn't going to do a whole load more research, but I'm going to put all of the numbers that I was in progress of researching for suicide rates up. And let's talk about them a little bit, because that was one of the points that he made. And absolutely, yes, suicide is a tremendous problem. It's a huge problem in the LGBTQ plus community, and specifically in the trans community. USTransSurvey.org does a survey. Gallup does some survey. The Trevor Project does some surveys. But we want to really dig into the suicide rates among the transgender population. So we're going to start with the US Trans Survey. So 98% of respondents who had socially or medically transitioned showed higher levels of happiness, thriving, and satisfaction. Nearly all of the respondents on gender-affirming hormone therapy, 98%, or who had gotten surgery, 97%, reported increased life satisfaction. Other respondents who had socially transitioned were more likely to report good health at 67%, compared to those who hadn't at 61%. And medically transitioned respondents reported even better outcomes, 70 versus 58%. So yet another survey showing that the transgendered population, when receiving appropriate medical care, is happier and better off. So the next thing we'll look at is the Trevor Project, who do a lot of surveying for the LGBTQ plus community, and we'll take a look at some of their key findings. We know that more than 1 in 10, or 12% of LGBTQ plus youth attempt suicide in the past year. 12%. 39% of LGBTQ plus young people considered attempting suicide in the past year, including 46% of transgender and non-binary young people. LGBTQ plus people of color reported higher rates than their white peers. 50%, half of LGBTQ plus youth who went to try to get mental health care in the past year could not get it. 50%. There's your problem right there. 54% of transgender and non-binary young people found their school to be gender affirming, and those who did reported lower rates of attempted suicide. 54%. The more accepting the community around you is of who you are as a person, the lower the suicide rate becomes. 90% of LGBTQ plus young people said that their well-being was negatively impacted by current politics. Their healthcare is being taken away. Their mental health care is being taken away. They're being called out. They're being brought to the forefront as a problem when all they want to do is live their lives and be left alone like the rest of us. We need to focus on giving everyone, I don't care if you're LGBTQ, I don't care if you're disabled, I don't care if you're cis, I don't care if you're gay, I don't care what you are. Every single one of us should have comprehensive health care, comprehensive mental health care, and the ability to exist in our lives as ourselves and make our own moral choices, make our own religious choices, form our own beliefs, and stop trying to force our thoughts and beliefs onto other people. If your beliefs involve taking rights away from other people, you don't believe in freedom. 45% of transgender and non-binary young people report that their family have considered moving to a different state because of the politics and laws in their state. 49% of LGBTQ plus youth aged 13 to 17 experienced bullying in the past year. Those who did report higher rates of attempted suicide than those who did not experience bullying. LGBTQ plus youth who report living in very accepting communities attempted suicide less than half the rate of those who reported living in unaccepted communities. So we keep circling back to the way the world treats you. If the world treats you like lesser, if the world tries to control your thoughts and your feelings, your suicide rate goes up. Leave these kids alone. Improve the guidelines for medical care, and watch the problem resolve itself. I highly encourage you to give a scroll through the Trevor Project's data. It breaks down suicide consideration, suicide attempt. It breaks down anxiety and depression. You can break down those things by gender identity, sexual orientation, age, race, ethnicity, all those kinds of fun things. And you can take a look at access to healthcare and things like that. So we've got, among all LGBTQ plus young people, 84% wanted more mental health care. 50% wanted mental health care in the past and were not able to get it. And among the 42% of young people who received psychological or emotional counseling in the last 12 months, the majority access services through one-on-one therapy. There's a lot of desire for mental health care and a lack of access for mental health care. So let's look at the reasons why these young people may have been unable to get health care. So being afraid to talk about it, again, community doesn't support you, you're going to be afraid to talk about it. Couldn't afford it, 40%. Didn't want to have to get a caregiver's permission, 37%. Afraid I wouldn't be taken seriously, 34%. Scared someone would call the police or involuntarily hospitalize me, 31%. Afraid it wouldn't work, 28%. Not out about my identity and afraid of being outed, 24%. Didn't feel they would understand my sexual orientation or gender identity, 22%. Didn't want someone thinking something's wrong with me, 22%. Have had a previous negative experience and did not want to have another one, 20%. Think about all of those and how they relate to acceptance and community and being able to talk about what you feel. Mental health care involves being able to talk about what you feel. We need to create an environment where these children feel comfortable talking about the thoughts and feelings that they're having, about going to a professional for the thoughts and feelings that they're having, and about making informed decisions on their healthcare. Whether that's, let's feel this out, let's, talk about it, let's get therapy, or whether it's, okay, we've kind of hit a point where it's time to try a puberty blocker or hormones, or think about what your future is going to look like, and what you want to try. It's all about informed decision making. It's all about comprehensive health care. This is what we need to offer. But instead, we're banning words from use in scientific communities and across government agencies. We're taking money out of the healthcare system, and we're putting the onus on a teeny tiny sliver of nothing of the population to try to point a finger that, as we disproved here, doesn't exist. So mull on this, take a look at the data yourself. But I've now done exhaustive research on this, and I cannot support any of these claims that were made. They're just not factual. The amount of exhaustive research I have done on this is so much more than what I've been able to cover in this video. And it's not only exhaustive, it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And there's so much more that I could have brought to the table for this. And the truth of the matter is, I just don't have any more time to dedicate to this. So I hope everybody learned something about what reality is behind the numbers in these communities, in these populations, and what the reality is of the solution being universal healthcare and better healthcare standards and practices, and better mental health care standards and practices. I don't hate anybody. I want honest, evidence-based conversations. I want to protect children from abuse in all settings, in churches, in homes, and in medical care facilities. And the truth at the end of the day is, the numbers show this is not a mass sterilization and mutilation conspiracy by the LGBTQ plus community. Most transgender youth are raised by straight parents, and their care decisions involve those families and their medical professionals. Regret rates are low, and better than other surgeries that youth are getting. And the real challenge is ensuring that we get thorough mental health care and careful patient evaluation for these young people, for these adults, for literally everyone. If you disagree, that's fine, but bring credible data and sources that are based on the U.S. population. So many of these studies are done in other countries that have completely different laws and regulations than we do, and a completely different political climate than we do right now. So focusing on U.S. data, I'm open to taking a look at it. I'm not going to shut down civil discourse. Keep the conversation respectful in the comments. Hopefully everyone has a great takeaway. But at the end of the day, the data shows what the data shows. Let me know your thoughts on this kind of content on this video, and if you want to see other topics covered in this level of depth. That's that for me. Here is a TLDR, simplified summary of findings without wading through the studies and watching the population calculations. If you watch this and have questions or opinions, watch the full version first and use the source list. I will tell you to do so if your question or statement can be answered or disproved there. There were two primary claims made by this creator that I researched. The first is that transgender parents are sterilizing and mutilating children who are presumed to be transgender. The second is there are hundreds of thousands of testimonies from children who are now adults who regret their care. And after those, we researched and discussed the mental health component regarding the comment about suicide. For the first claim, we used study and demographic data to determine that there are 399,000 transgender parents in the USA. Any and all assumptions we made to keep things simple along the way were made in a way that favors this argument. We determined the 399,000 transgender parents have approximately 774,060 kids. Of those kids, 36% are 12 to 17 years old, which is 278,662 kids. Of those kids, 3.3% are likely to identify as transgender. That's 9,493 kids that are at risk of receiving medical intervention from this segment of the LGBTQ plus population per the claim. This is 0.013% of the youth in the United States, or 0.04% of the youth aged 12 to 17 in the USA. With our at-risk population identified, we then went on to determine how many of those would receive medical interventions in the form of drugs and surgery. To match the known population growth, we also doubled the number of procedures and determined that 1.4% will go on to receive these interventions. That is 134 kids receiving any intervention and only 8 of those being surgery. While this data already sufficiently disproves the claim, we also need to know how many of these kids regret the care they received. We calculated that 6, rounded up from 5.5, of these kids are likely to regret their care. To add perspective, that is 0.002% of all of the 278,662 children with transgender parents. With the original claim disproved, I decided to expand the claim to children of all LGBTQ+ people. We know this is 5 million kids, so we did all the math again with the same methodology and found 2,310 kids receiving medical interventions, with 132 of those being surgery. This is 0.003% of the minor population in the USA. I decided to try one more method to favor the argument and made the assumption that no cis-hetero parent ever lets their child get intervention and assigned all of the kids in the USA that receive these treatments to the LGBTQ+ community. This method gave us 9,768 kids getting medical intervention, with 556 of those being surgery. This gave us 0.01% of the youth population, or 0.04% of the youth population aged 12 to 17. Even adding bias to favor the argument, we land on less than 1/10 of 1% of youth aged 12 to 17. This claim has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt to be demonstrably false. Moving on to the second claim. In order to prove there are hundreds of thousands of testimonies, we need to prove there are hundreds of thousands of people who regret their care to provide these testimonies. To make this easy, we assumed everyone who regrets their care provides a testimony. We used study data to determine how many people are likely to detransition and how many of those do so for reasons that indicate regret. Then we expand the data based on the population growth from the year 2024 to 2025, leaving us with 46,587 people in the United States in 2025 who regret receiving gender-affirming care in the form of drugs or surgery. This claim has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt to be demonstrably false. In this video, I also addressed articles that were provided by a commenter on the initial post, discussed current legal cases of detransitioning people, suing medical professionals, and reviewed why legal recourse is important but does not justify the removal of this population's right to access care. I then reviewed regret rates of other common surgeries because ignoring analogous factors would be a disservice. They're all higher than gender-affirming surgery rates. Then I reviewed the cosmetic surgery rates for minors and found that even with data from just 762 surgeons, breast and genital surgeries on cisgender minors is 0.004% of kids in the US, while all surgeries for transgender minors is only 0.0007%. Once again, proving that the focus on transgender or gender dysphoric individuals and medical care involving drugs and surgery is not the right focus. We then entered a discussion on mental health care and reviewed mental health data from these populations. Suicide is a major problem in these communities, and we determined that lack of access or ability to get mental health care is a large contributing factor, as is the lack of feeling of acceptance by the community. We concluded, if we want to solve these problems, we need comprehensive and universal mental and physical health care, and we need to accept the thoughts and feelings of others to foster safety and community while these individuals seek out therapy and other medical interventions as they and their healthcare team see fit. And of course, in those rare cases where something does go wrong, they do have the legal system for recourse. That's the TLDR summary of everything that we did here. If you have questions, if there's anything that's weirding you out, go watch the full video. I will just ping you back to it if you're asking questions that can be answered there. Of course, all of the resources are linked below in a document. I hope you learned something. I hope you had some great takeaways. Keep discourse civil, and let me know down in the comments if there are other topics that you would like to see covered in this level of depth. That's it for me.